So today's objective is to be able to identify the properties of real numbers by using their keywords. So first we're going to learn about these properties and we're going to find strategies that are going to help us identify them. However, before we start learning about our properties, we first got to know, well, what are real numbers? And real numbers is just a collection of all types of numbers that you can think of. So any rational number, irrational number, any whole number, any fraction, any decimal, square roots, etc. So these rules that we're going to learn, or these properties that we're going to learn, they're going to apply to all the types of numbers that we've learned how to work with before. The first property that we're going to start with is the commutative property. Now these properties, you're going to see that most of them will apply to both addition and multiplication as well. The commutative property for addition tells us that you can add in any order. So the terms that you are adding can switch places with each other and still give us the same results. So if I add a plus b, well, that's the same thing as b plus a. Or another example, if I add 2 plus 3, well, that's 5, which is the same thing that 3 plus 2 gives us as well. So in the commutative property, the key word is that the order changes, but it still gives us the same thing. And it's the same thing that can be applied to multiplication. The commutative property for multiplication tells us that you can multiply in any order as well. So the terms can switch places with each other and still give us the same results. So if I multiply a times b, that's the same thing as multiplying b times a. Or in another more specific example, 2 times 3 gives me 6, which is the same thing that 3 times 2 will give me. So again, the key word for the commutative property is that things switch places or they change the order with each other, but still give us the same results. The next property that we're going to learn about is the associative property. The associative property for addition tells us that you can group terms in different ways without changing the order and still get the same results. So if I have these three terms that I'm adding, a plus b plus c, I can add b plus c first and then add a to it, but it'll give me the same thing as me adding a plus b first and then adding c to it. I haven't changed the order of how things have been given to me, but I've added them in different groups and still giving me the same answer. So for example, if I have 2 plus 3 plus 6, I can add 3 plus 6 first and then add 2 to it, and that'll give me 11. Or I can add 2 plus 3 first to give me 5, and if I add 6 to that, it'll also give me 11. So the associative property doesn't change the order of things, right? I still have 2, then 3, then 6 in the same order, but it changes the grouping, right? The things that you're grouping. So in the left-hand side, I had 3 and 6 grouped and then added 2. And in the right-hand side, I had 2 and 3 grouped and then added 6, but still gave me 11. So the groupings have changed, the order has not, and it'll still give us the same answer. So, and just to compare that to the commutative property, in the commutative property, the order does change. In the associative property, the order does not, only the grouping. And the same thing can be applied to multiplication. You can group numbers to be multiplied in different ways without changing the order and still get the same results. So for example, I can multiply 2 times 3 times 6 by multiplying 3 and 6 first and get 36. Or I can multiply 2 times 3 times 6 by multiplying 2 and 3 first and still get the same exact results. So again, my order is still the same. I have 2, then 3, and then 6, but the terms that are grouped are different on either side of the example. So in associative property, your groupings change, but your order must remain the same. We also have what we call the identity property. And the identity property for addition tells me that the sum of any number and 0 gives you the same number back. So if I have a plus 0, that's still going to give me a back. Or if I have 0 plus a, that's also going to give me the same exact thing back, meaning a is going to keep its identity. Okay, we're going to get the same exact thing back. The answer that we get is going to be identical to what we started with. So a plus 0, for example, is still going to give me 8, which is identical to what we started with. And 0 plus 8 is also still going to give me 8. Okay, so the identity of whatever term we're adding 0 to remains the same. Now, multiplication is a little different. In multiplication, in order to get the same number back, in order to keep the identity of that number, you're not going to multiply by 0, you're going to multiply by 1. So the identity property of multiplication tells me that the product of any number and 1 is the same number. So 8 times 1, for example, is equal to A. Or in a more specific example, 8 times 1 is going to give me 8, or 1 times 8 is also going to give me 8 as well. So you can see that some of these things we already know. We already know that we can add things in different order and still get the same thing. We know that we can group things differently and still get the same exact thing. And I know that I can multiply by 1 and get the same number back because we practiced some of these things before. Today, we're just giving these properties a name. We're looking to see what are the properties that allow us to do these things that we already do on a regular basis. So for the identity property, what you have to remember is that in order to keep the identity of a number, if you're adding, you have to add 0 to it. And if you are multiplying, you have to multiply by 1. Now we're looking at the inverse property. And again, these are things that we kind of already know from before that we're giving it a name to. So first, we're going to start with the inverse property of addition. So the inverse property of addition tells me that the sum of any number and its opposite, or the number with an opposite sign, is equal to 0. So if I have A plus negative A, that's going to give me 0. Or for example, if I have 8 plus negative 8, that's also going to give me 0. And in this case, negative 8 is what we call the additive inverse of positive 8. The additive inverse of any number is whatever number I can add to it to give me 0. So the additive inverse of 8 is negative 8. Now, when it comes to the inverse property of multiplication, this property tells us that the product of any number and its reciprocal is equal to 1. Now, the reciprocal of a number is just basically that number flipped around. So if I have A over B, for example, the reciprocal of that number is just B over A. So I took that fraction and just flipped it. And when I multiply those two things, that's going to give me 1. So for example, if I had the number 8, any whole number can be written as 8 over 1. So if I have the number 8 over 1 and I multiply it by its reciprocal, which is 1 over 8, that's going to give me a positive 1. Or if I have the fraction 2 over 3, for example, and I multiply it by its reciprocal, which is 3 over 2, that's going to also give me a positive 1. Now, its reciprocal is what we call the multiplicative inverse of that number. So 1 over 8 is the multiplicative inverse of 8 over 1. Or 3 over 2 is the multiplicative inverse of 2 over 3. Because when you multiply these numbers, they're going to give us 1 back. Know that the multiplicative inverse does not have to have the opposite sign of that number. It has the exact same sign. So that multiplicative inverse of 8 over 1 is positive 1 over 8. And the multiplicative inverse of 2 over 3 is positive 3 over 2. So the signs don't flip. The signs change when we're talking about the additive inverse. So just to summarize, when we're looking for the inverse in addition, it's the same number but with the opposite sign, which we'll add to give us 0. And when we're looking for the inverse in multiplication, it's the number flipped with the same sign that when we multiply will give us 1. Another property that is good to know is the zero property of multiplication, which basically tells us that the product of 0 and any number is always 0. So if I multiply any number by 0, it's just going to always give me 0 back. And then last but not least, we have the property that we've been working with for a very long time now, which is the distributive property. And the distributive property tells us that when you're multiplying a term by terms that are being added in parentheses, you can distribute the multiplication across both terms and then add their products. What does that mean? Exactly what we know how to do before. If I have 2 times parentheses 4 plus 3, I can do 2 times 4 plus 2 times 3, and it'll always give me the same answer. So for your task, there's a lot of terms and examples that I've just shared with you. So you want to just use your video to make sure that you're answering the questions. Go back and forth throughout the video to make sure you remember what each property means and the examples that can be useful when you're answering your own questions. It could also be helpful to take pictures of the video as I'm summarizing the properties in order to help you complete your task. But everything you will need for your task is all in this video.